Greetings, travelers of the cosmic deep. Tonight, we venture beyond the familiar chronicles of light and shadow, into the hushed chambers where forgotten truths slumber beneath layers of galactic dust. Here, in the twilight between waking and dreams, we shall unfold a tale that the archives dare not whisper, story of prophecy and storm, of a hunger that transcends mortality itself. Let the distant hum of starships fade. Let the weight of the day dissolve like morning mist, and allow yourself to drift into the vast tapestry of a galaxy's most carefully guarded secret. Close your eyes and let the ancient words carry you into the darkness where all stories begin. In the hushed corridors beneath Theed, where the weight of Naboo's royal heritage pressed down like the accumulated breath of centuries, a young senator moved through shadows that seemed older than the planet's recorded history. Palpatine, already bearing the invisible brand of Sith apprenticeship, ascended stone steps, worn smooth by generations of pilgrims. And politicians, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the amber light of glorods that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. The air grew thick with the scent of ancient stone and the metallic temps of deep places where moisture gathered in patient droplets that had been falling for millennia. His footsteps echoed in the vault-like silence, each sound swallowed by the hungry darkness that stretched beyond the reach of his modest illumination. The catacombs of Theed were a labyrinth of forgotten chambers, repositories of artifacts that predated the current royal line. Relics of ages when Naboo's civilization had different names for the stars. Here, among the crumbling reliefs of the four sages of Dwarshi, something waited. The massive stone faces gazed down from their eternal vigil, their expressions weathered by time but still holding traces of the wisdom, more perhaps the warnings they had once embodied. Brata the gullible, Sistros the proud, Yanjan the wise, and Faya the benevolent watched as Palpatine's fingers traced the worn edges of their pedestals, seeking the hidden mechanisms that legends claimed lay concealed within their foundations. The young senator's breath misted in the cool air as he worked, his political training serving him well in this archaeological endeavor. Patience, observation, the careful application of pressure at precisely the right moment, skills that would serve him equally well in Senate chambers and ancient tombs. When the hidden panel finally gave way with a whisper of displaced stone, the sound seemed to ripple through the Force itself, as if reality had been holding its breath for this moment. Within the concealed reliquary, wrapped in veils of spider silk and time, lay treasures that no museum would ever catalog. The obsidian shard caught the glorod's light and held it, transforming the amber glow into something deeper, more primal. Its surface was covered in inscriptions that seemed to shift and writhe in the dancing illumination. Characters from a script that predated the galactic standard by eon. Beside it, a page of vellum so thin it seemed translucent lay folded with the reverence reserved for sacred texts. As Palpatine lifted the artifacts with trembling hands, the Force around him began to sing a low, thrumming melody that resonated in his bones and set his teeth on edge. The words etched into the obsidian seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, speaking of storms and doors of vessels and veils, of pathways that led beyond the boundary between life and the luminous realm that lay waiting in the spaces between heartbeats. The inscription spoke of a storm-bearer, a living gate through which the impossible might be made manifest. It whispered of the black hours, an epoch lost to conventional history when prophecy was not written but sung. when the ancient Sith had discovered truths so profound and terrible that they could only be transmitted through ritual and rhythm, through the careful modulation of syllables that could reshape reality itself. Standing in that buried chamber, surrounded by the stone sentinels of forgotten wisdom, Palpatine felt the first stirrings of a hunger that would consume decades of his life. The Force trembled around him like a plucked string, resonating with frequencies that no Jedi would ever comprehend. Harmonies that spoke not of balance, but of transcendence, of the shattering of limitations that lesser beings accepted as immutable law. The discovery burned in his mind as he carefully sealed the reliquary and retraced his steps through the winding passages. Above him, the palace of Theed continued its stately dance of politics and protocol, unaware that in its very foundations the future emperor had found the first thread of a tapestry that would reshape the galaxy. The obsidian shard rested heavy in his robes, its weight seemingly far greater than mere stone, as if it contained the compressed density of collapsed stars. In the weeks that followed, Palpatine moved through his senatorial duties with the measured calm of a man who had glimpsed the edge of infinity. The routine business of trade disputes and territorial negotiations seemed suddenly trivial, mere ripples on the surface of an ocean whose depths contained wonders and terrors beyond imagination. But he maintained his facade of earnest dedication, even as his nights were consumed with the careful translation of archaic texts and the patient assembly of fragments that had been scattered across centuries. The obsidian shard proved to be more than mere inscription. It was a key, a fragment of a larger holocron that had been deliberately broken and hidden across multiple worlds. Through techniques learned at his master's side, Palpatine gradually coaxed the fragment into revealing its secrets, feeding it with carefully modulated applications of the dark side until it began to resonate with the deeper currents of the Force. The spectral chants that emerged from the activated shard filled his private chambers with voices that seemed to echo from the deepest wells of time. They spoke in the old tongue, in dialects that had been forbidden since the days of Exegol's liturgies, when the Sith had been more than warriors and politicians, when they had been priests of a cosmic truth that transcended the petty concerns of empire and conquest. The Four-Storm prophecy, as he came to call it, described a phenomenon that made his master's experiments with midichlorian manipulation seem like a child's finger painting compared to the masterworks of the ancient masters, where Plagueis sought to extend life to preserve the physical form against the inevitable decay of time. The prophecy spoke of something far more profound, the creation of a living conduit through which consciousness itself could pass from one state of existence to another. The Stormbearer, according to the spectral voices, would be born not of mortal union, but of the Force itself, conceived in a moment when the galaxy's spiritual equilibrium teetered on the edge of collapse. This being would possess an unprecedented connection to the cosmic energies that bound all living things, but more importantly, their emotional resonance would be capable of generating what the texts called a maelstrom of anguish, a psychic tempest powerful enough to tear holes in the very fabric that separated the realm of the living from the luminous mystery that lay beyond death. The prophecy described the process in terms that were both poetic and precise. 3 wounds would be carved into the vessel's spirit, fear transformed into rage, love poisoned by the certainty of loss, and the ultimate betrayal of one's deepest principles. Each wound would serve as a note in a cosmic symphony, and when all 3 resonated in perfect harmony, The resulting storm would be capable of rending what the texts called the Veltha Gossamer Barrier that prevented the dead from returning and the living from crossing over at will. Night after night, Palpatine worked to decode the ritual's requirements, cross-referencing the obsidian fragments with texts he acquired through increasingly elaborate networks of antiquarian dealers and tomb robbers. The prophecy demanded not just a suitable vessel, but a complex array of focusing artifacts mirrors to concentrate the storm's energy, keys to unlock the barriers between dimensions, and a precise astronomical alignment that occurred perhaps once in a millennium. As his understanding deepened, so did his realization of the prophecy's true magnitude. This was not merely another Sith technique for extending one's lifespan or increasing one's power within the conventional understanding of the Force. The Force Storm prophecy described a fundamental alteration of the relationship between consciousness and existence itself, a way to step outside the cycle of life and death entirely, to become something that transcended the very categories of mortal and immortal. The implications set his hands trembling as he worked by candlelight in his private study, surrounded by scrolls and tablets that would have been considered priceless by any scholar of galactic history. If the prophecy was accurate, if such a transformation was indeed possible, then everything the Jedi taught about the Force, everything the Sith had traditionally pursued, was merely the first stammering syllable of a far greater language. But the prophecy also carried warnings, woven throughout its verses like threads of shadow in a tapestry of starlight. The storm, once awakened, could not be easily controlled. The vessel, if not properly prepared, might be destroyed by the very forces they were meant to channel. And most ominously, the texts suggested that the knowledge itself was dangerous, that sharing the prophecy's secrets with another being would somehow diminish its power, scattering the storm's energy across multiple wills and rendering the entire endeavor futile. This last warning resonated through Palpatine's mind with particular clarity as he considered his relationship with his master. Darth Plagueis had spent decades pursuing his own vision of transcendence, experimenting with the manipulation of life itself, seeking to unlock the secret of defeating death through scientific understanding of the Force's biological mechanisms. But the Black Hour Codex suggested a different path, entirely not the preservation of the physical form, but the liberation of consciousness from its dependence on flesh and blood. The young apprentice began to realize that his master's research, profound though it was, represented only one approach to the fundamental question that had driven Sith philosophy for millennia. Plagueis sought to make the mortal vessel eternal. The prophecy offered a way to transcend the need for vessels entirely. One was the path of the craftsman, seeking to perfect his tools. The other was the way of the artist, learning to paint with light itself. As winter settled over Naboo's capital, Palpatine found himself walking the same corridors where he had first discovered the obsidian fragments. But now the familiar passages seemed transformed by his growing knowledge. The stone faces of the four sages no longer appeared as mere historical curiosities. They had become silent, witnesses to his gradual initiation into mysteries that had once been their sacred trust. The Force Storm prophecy had awakened something in him that went beyond mere ambition or desire for power. It was a hunger for understanding, a thirst for the kind of transcendence that would make all earthly concerns, planets, species, galactic civilizations, seem as temporary and insignificant as the dancing shadows cast by a candle flame. He had tasted the possibility of becoming something unprecedented in galactic history, and the flavor of that possibility had rendered all other pursuits pale and unsatisfying. But first, he would need to find the Stormbearer. According to the prophecy, the vessel would be born when the galaxy's spiritual equilibrium reached a critical instability, when the actions of those who manipulated the Force created ripples significant enough to generate a corresponding response from the cosmic order itself. The timing could not be forced, but it could be encouraged through careful manipulation of the very currents that Plagueis was already disturbing with his experiments. The apprentice smiled in the darkness of the ancient passages, his expression invisible to any observer, but somehow sensed by the stone guardians who had watched over these secrets for so many centuries. Soon, he would need to begin the delicate work of positioning himself for the prophecy's fulfillment. But tonight, he would savor the weight of knowledge that no other living being possessed. The storm was coming, and he would be ready to guide it when it arrived. Above Naboo's northern continent, where the aurora painted sheets of ethereal light across a sky deeper than velvet, Darth Plagueis stood on a balcony that jutted from his apprentice's private residence like the prow of a ship sailing through an ocean of stars. The Muin's elongated features were cast in sharp relief by the dancing radiance above, his pale skin seeming to glow with its own internal luminescence as he contemplated the cosmic forces that he had spent decades learning to manipulate. The night was unseasonably warm, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers and the distant ozone signature of the planet's unique atmospheric phenomena. Plagueis breathed deeply, allowing the Force to flow through him in patterns that had become as natural as his own heartbeat. Through his enhanced perception, he could sense the vast web of life that surrounded them, millions of interconnected consciousness, creating a symphony of existence that most beings could never fully appreciate. Behind him, soft footsteps announced his apprentice's approach. Palpatine moved with the measured grace that had become his signature in the halls of political power. But Plagueis could sense the subtle tension that ran beneath his student's carefully maintained composure. There was something different about the young human tonight, an undercurrent of excitement that he was working to conceal behind his usual mask of deferential attention. "Master," Palpatine said, his voice carrying the formal respect that their relationship demanded, even in private, "the aurora is particularly magnificent this evening. I thought you might enjoy observing it while we discuss your latest findings." Plagueis nodded without turning, his elongated hands clasped behind his back as he continued to study the shifting patterns of light that danced across the heavens. The electromagnetic fluctuations that create these displays are not unlike the midichlorian resonances I've been studying, he murmured, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone of a being who had learned to find profound connections in seemingly unrelated phenomena. Both represent the interaction between invisible forces and visible matter, the marriage of energy and substance that underlies all existence. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, master and apprentice contemplating the cosmic ballet unfolding above them. But Plagueis's enhanced senses detected the subtle changes in his student's breathing pattern, the minute shifts in posture that indicated a mind working through complex calculations. The younger Sith was preparing to introduce a topic that he had been considering for some time. "I've been reflecting on our recent conversations about the nature of life itself," Palpatine began carefully, his tone suggesting scholarly curiosity rather than any deeper agenda. Your experiments with midichlorian manipulation suggest possibilities that extend far beyond mere healing or life extension. Have you considered the implications of actually creating life, rather than simply preserving it? The question hung in the Oro-Ro-painted air like a challenge disguised as academic inquiry. Plagueis finally turned to regard his apprentice, noting the careful neutrality of the human-s expression and the way his hands remained perfectly still at his sides. This was a conversation that Palpatine had been building toward for weeks, perhaps months, and the Moon found himself intrigued by the particular angle his student had chosen to explore. The creation of life, Plagueis repeated slowly, tasting the words as if they were wine of uncertain vintage. An interesting proposition. You speak, I assume, of true creation, the generation of living consciousness from pure force energy, rather than the mere acceleration of existing biological processes. Palpatine inclined his head slightly, a gesture that managed to convey both agreement and the suggestion that his master's understanding exceeded his own. Precisely. I've been studying some of the more obscure texts in my collection, fragments that seem to suggest such feats were once attempted by ancient practitioners. The theoretical framework appears to revolve around creating a resonance cascade that would convince the Force itself to generate a new focal point for consciousness. The apprentice's words were carefully chosen, dancing around the edges of truths that he dared not reveal completely. The obsidian fragments had indeed described such processes, but in the context of the Four-Storm prophecy, rather than mere academic speculation. Palpatine was probing his master's research, while simultaneously gauging how much of his own discoveries he could safely reveal. Plagueis moved to a stone table, where a decanter of Naboo wine waited beside two crystal glasses. He poured with the deliberate precision that characterized all his actions, the liquid catching the aurora's light and transforming it into liquid fire. The texts you reference likely originate from the period following the Great Scourge of Malachor, he said, offering one glass to his apprentice. When the survivors of that catastrophe sought ways to replace the vast numbers of Force-sensitive beings who had been lost to the mass shadow generator's activation, they sipped the wine in contemplative silence, both Sith working through the implications of the conversation's direction. Plagueis was intrigued by his apprentice's apparent knowledge of historical texts that he himself had not encountered, while Palpatine was carefully measuring how much of his master's research aligned with the prophecy's requirements. The challenge, Plagueis continued, swirling his wine thoughtfully, lies not in the theoretical possibility, but in the practical application. Creating life would require more than mere manipulation of midichlorians. It would demand a fundamental understanding of how consciousness itself arises from the interaction of force, energy, and organic matter. We would need to comprehend not just the mechanism, but the spark, the ineffable moment when potential becomes actuality. Palpatine nodded with the enthusiasm of a dedicated student, encountering profound wisdom. And such understanding would presumably require extensive experimentation, careful observation of the processes that govern natural conception and birth. One would need to study the precise conditions under which the Force chooses to create new focal points for consciousness. Indeed, Plagueis agreed, though something in his apprentice's phrasing triggered a subtle resonance in his enhanced perception. There was a specificity to Palpatine's language that suggested more than theoretical interest, though I should note that such experiments would necessarily be conducted in the deepest secrecy. The Jedi would view any such research as the ultimate violation of their precious balance, and even many Sith would consider it an overreach of dangerous proportions. The aurora above them shifted into new configurations, bands of green and gold light-weaving patterns that seemed almost like script written across the heavens. Both Sith felt the Force ripple around them, responding to currents of intention and possibility that ran deeper than their spoken words. They were discussing more than philosophy. They were laying the groundwork for actions that could reshape the fundamental nature of life in the galaxy. "Of course," Palpatine murmured, his voice carrying the weight of shared conspiracy. "Such work would require the utmost discretion, but surely the potential rewards justify the risks. Imagine having the ability to create beings specifically attuned to our purposes, vessels perfectly suited for the preservation and advancement of Sith knowledge." Plagueis studied his apprentice over the rim of his crystal glass, noting the way the younger human's eyes reflected the aurora's shifting colors. There was something in that gaze that went beyond mere academic fascination, a hunger that resonated with his own deepest ambitions. But there was also something else, a sense of knowledge held in reserve, of connections already made that his student was not yet ready to reveal. "You speak as if you've given this considerable thought," the moon observed, his tone carrying just enough edge to suggest that such independent research might be viewed as presumptuous. "Have you encountered specific texts that outline the practical steps for such creation?" The question was a test, and both beings knew it. Palpatine's response would determine how much trust his master was willing to extend, and how much autonomy he would be permitted in pursuing his own areas of interest. The apprentice took a careful sip of wine, using the pause to formulate a response that would satisfy Plagueis' curiosity without revealing the true extent of his discoveries. "Fragments only," he replied, with precisely the right blend of frustration and scholarly passion. Tantalizing hints scattered across multiple sources, like pieces of a puzzle that refuses to reveal its complete image. But the recurring themes suggest that the ancients at least believed such feats were possible. Given sufficient understanding of the Force's deepest mysteries, Plagueis nodded slowly, accepting the explanation, while filing away his apprentice's careful evasions for future consideration. The younger Sith was clearly pursuing his own research agenda, but that was not necessarily problematic. Independence of thought was a valuable trait in an apprentice, as long as it remained subordinate to the master's overall vision. "Then perhaps we should consider combining our efforts," the moon suggested, his voice carrying the warmth of magnanimous collaboration. "Your historical research, coupled with my practical experimentation, might yield insights that neither of us could achieve alone. The creation of life may indeed be possible, but it will require resources and knowledge that span centuries of accumulated wisdom." Above them, the aurora began to fade, as Naboo's rotation carried their continent away from the optimal viewing angle. But the conversation had achieved its purpose for both participants. Plagueis believed he had enlisted his apprentice's support for his ongoing experiments, while Palpatine had learned enough about his master's methods to understand how they might be adapted to serve the prophecy's requirements. As they prepared to return indoors, both Sith were already planning the next phase of their respective agendas. Neither fully trusted the other, but both recognized the value of maintaining their partnership until their individual goals had been achieved. The Force swirled around them like a river of possibilities that would soon converge in ways that neither master nor apprentice could fully anticipate. The Aurora's final whispers painted their faces in shades of green and gold as they walked back toward the residence to beings who had just committed themselves to a course of action that would echo through the decades to come. Above them, the stars continued their eternal dance, unaware that the conversation they had witnessed would ultimately determine the fate of countless worlds and the destiny of the galaxy itself. On the edge of the galaxy's spiral arm, where the last traces of civilization gave way to the infinite darkness between stars, the desert world of Tatooine turned its scarred face toward twin suns that painted its surface in shades of amber and rust. Here, in a landscape that seemed to exist outside the flow of galactic time, the Force moved in patterns that were both ancient and immediate, weaving through the silence between grains of sand and the spaces between heartbeats. In a modest dwelling that crouched against the desert's endless horizon, like a creature seeking shelter from the cosmic vastness, Shmi Skywalker felt something shift in the rhythm of her world. She stood at her small window, watching the night settle over the dune sea like a blanket woven from starlight and shadow. But her attention was drawn inward to a sensation that had no name in any language she knew. The night wind carried scents that seemed to come from beyond the physical desert fragrances of ozone and possibility, of metal and growing things, of futures that hung in the air like distant thunder. Shmi pressed her palm against the cool, transparent steel of the window and felt her heartbeat synchronize with something vast and patient that moved beneath the surface of reality. She was a woman who had learned to read the subtle signs that others missed, to find meaning in the way the wind shifted or the particular quality of light that preceded sandstorms. But this sensation was different from any weather pattern or geological phenomenon she had experienced. It felt like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to unfold. Across the galaxy, ripples from Plagueis and Palpatine's experiments continued to propagate through the Force, their manipulations of life and consciousness creating disturbances in the cosmic equilibrium that demanded a response. The Force, which the Jedi understood as a field of energy that surrounded and penetrated all living things, was far more complex and willful than their philosophy admitted. When pushed too far from balance, it would act to restore itself through means that transcended conventional understanding of cause and effect. Shmi felt the first flutter of response deep within her body, a warmth that began in her core and spread outward like ripples on a still pond. At first she assumed it was merely the after effect of the day's work. She had spent long hours in Watto's shop, bent over the delicate internal mechanisms of Padracer engines that required both technical skill and intuitive understanding to repair properly. But as the sensation deepened and took on qualities that seemed to resonate with the Force currents she had learned to sense during her years of slavery, she began to understand that something unprecedented was occurring. The warmth was not fatigue or illness, it was presence, consciousness forming in response to cosmic necessity. The night deepened around her simple home, and with it came visitors that existed only in the realm of dreams and visions. Shmi found herself drifting into a state that was neither sleep nor waking, where the boundaries between self and universe became gossamer thin. In this liminal space, she encountered beings of light and shadow who spoke in languages that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her soul. They showed her images that she would later struggle to remember, in their full clarity visions of storms made of living lightning, of doors opening onto landscapes that existed beyond the known dimensions of space and time, of a child who could serve as both key and lock in mechanisms of cosmic significance. The beings spoke of balance and imbalance, of choices that would echo across generations, of love that would prove both salvation and destruction. In the deepest hour of the night, when even the hardy desert creatures sought shelter from the mysterious forces that moved through the darkness, the conception occurred. It was not a moment of physical union, but of cosmic convergence. When the Force S response to the Galaxy S spiritual crisis took form in the most intimate space of human existence, consciousness sparked into being, not through mortal desire, but through the universe's need for balance, for a focal point through which vast energies could be channeled and vast purposes fulfilled. Shmi gasped as she felt the moment of creation, a sensation like lightning striking from within, illuminating every cell of her body with significance that went far beyond personal experience. She understood with a clarity that would fade but never entirely disappear, that she had become the vessel for something that transcended individual destiny, that the child now forming within her would serve purposes that stretched far beyond the horizons of Tatooine's twin suns. The Force sang around her dwelling like a choir of wind and starlight, its harmony deeper and more complex than any music composed by mortal hands. Through the desert night, creatures that had never before shown interest in the doings of the slave quarters turned their attention toward the small adobe structure where miracles were taking root. Banthas lowed in harmonies that seemed to echo the cosmic frequencies, while dewback lizards raised their heads toward stars that pulsed with unusual intensity. In the distance, the Tusken Raiders, who called the deep desert their home, felt the disturbance through their connection to the land's ancient rhythms. Their shamans emerged from their tents to study the star patterns, reading in the celestial configurations signs of change that their oral traditions had prepared them to recognize. They spoke in hushed voices of the old prophecies that described a child of two suns who would bring both endings and beginnings to the Galaxy-S long story. As dawn approached and the night's visions began to fade into the softer realm of memory, Shmi placed both hands on her still flat abdomen and whispered words of welcome to the consciousness that had chosen her as its gateway into physical existence. She did not fully understand the cosmic forces that had selected her for this honor, but she recognized the weight of responsibility that now rested within her womb. The child that would be born would carry within his cells a connection to the Force unlike any that had existed since the ancient days when the galaxy was young and the barriers between dimensions were more permeable. He would be capable of generating the spiritual storms that the Obsidian prophecies described, of serving as a conduit through which consciousness itself could travel between states of existence. But all of that lay in a future that seemed as distant as the galaxy's core. For now there was only the quiet miracle of new life taking root in the fertile darkness of a mother's love. While twin suns prepared to rise over a world that had no idea it was about to become the birthplace of legend, Shmi smiled as she felt the first faint stirrings of the presence that would grow to become Anakin Skywalker. And in that moment of pure maternal joy, the Force itself seemed to sigh with satisfaction. The Stormbearer had been conceived, and the first step toward the prophecy's fulfillment was complete. The desert wind carried her contentment across the dunes, mixing it with the ancient songs that the sand had been singing for millennia, adding one more verse to the endless ballad of hope and destiny that echoed through the galaxy's forgotten corners. Years flowed like sand through an hourglass, and the modest slave quarters of Tatooine gave way to the gleaming corridors of Coruscant's most prestigious levels. The child conceived in the desert-esque mystical silence had grown into a young man whose connection to the Force blazed like a beacon that could be sensed across star systems. Now, in the aftermath of the Trade Federation's defeat and the emergence of a new galactic crisis, Chancellor Palpatine stood in his private office, high above the capital world's endless, urban landscape, feeling the cosmic mechanisms clicking into place with the precision of a master chronometer. Through the vast transparisteel windows that framed his sanctuary of power, the lights of 1,000,000,000,000 beings created patterns that shifted like constellations in constant motion. But Palpatine's attention was focused inward, on the subtle harmonics of the Force that sang of convergence and possibility. The boy from Tatooine, Anakin Skywalker, had been brought before the Jedi Council, had been tested and found to possess exactly the qualities that the Obsidian prophecies had described in their spectral chants. The Chancellor's fingers traced the edges of a small artifact that rested on his desk like a paperweight of unusual design. To any casual observer, it appeared to be nothing more than a curiosity from Naboo's ancient past, a carved stone piece that might have been acquired during one of his archaeological expeditions. But beneath its innocuous surface lay one of the fragments of the obsidian holocron, its dormant inscriptions waiting to be awakened by the proper application of dark side energy. Tonight would mark the completion of a ritual that had been years in preparation. The Stormbearer had been identified and was now within reach of Sith influence. More importantly, the one being in the galaxy who might have interfered with the prophecy's fulfillment, Darth Plagueis, soon be removed from the equation permanently. The Moonmaster's experiments with midichlorian manipulation had served their purpose, creating the cosmic disturbances that had prompted the Force to generate its own response in the form of Anakin's conception. But Plagueis' vision of immortality through biological manipulation was fundamentally incompatible with the transcendence that the Force Storm prophecy offered. The older Sith sought to preserve the vessel. The prophecy required its transformation into something far more profound. Palpatine activated a small communications device that connected him to his most trusted agents throughout the galaxy. The network he had spent decades building. Politicians, military officers, corporate executives, and criminal overlords would now serve a purpose that none of them could imagine. Through carefully orchestrated manipulations, they would ensure that young Skywalker remained accessible to Sith influence while appearing to operate under Jedi protection. The first phase of the great work was nearly complete. The Stormbearer had been born and identified. The preliminary wounds that would shape his spiritual resonance were already being prepared through subtle manipulations of circumstance and relationship. But before the prophecy's fulfillment could begin in earnest, the last obstacle to absolute control over the ritual's parameters had to be eliminated. Palpatine rose from his chair and moved to a hidden chamber that adjoined his official office, a space that existed in no architectural plans and could be accessed only through knowledge of the building's original Sith construction techniques. Here, surrounded by artifacts that spanned millennia of dark side research, he began the preparations for a celebration that would mark both an ending and a beginning. The chamber filled with the soft radiance of candles, whose flames had been treated with alchemical compounds that enhanced their resonance with force energies. Each light source was positioned according to calculations derived from the obsidian fragments, creating a pattern that would focus and amplify the spiritual energies generated by the evening's activities. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation as ancient mechanisms awakened from their long slumber. On a table carved from malachor stone, Palpatine arranged the implements that would be needed for the night's work. A ceremonial blade whose edge had been honed on the whetstones of lost worlds. A chalice forged from metals that had been exposed to the radiations of dying stars. Texts written in scripts that predated the Republic by millennia, their pages crackling with the accumulated power of generations of Sith scholars. The ritual that would claim his master's life had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of Palpatine's endeavors. It would appear to be nothing more than a quiet evening of scholarly discussion to Sith lords, sharing wine and conversation in the comfort of luxurious surroundings. But beneath the surface of civilized discourse, deeper currents would be flowing, energies that would transform murder into something approaching sacrament. Plagueis would die not merely because he had become an obstacle to his apprentice's ambitions, but because his death would serve as the first true note in the symphony that would ultimately awaken the Force Storm, the taking of a life that had itself tampered with the fundamental forces of existence would create ripples in the cosmic order that would resonate for decades to come, preparing the universe for the greater transformations that lay ahead. As the appointed hour approached, Palpatine allowed himself a moment of profound satisfaction. Everything that he had worked toward since that night in the catacombs beneath Theed was finally coming to fruition. The prophecy that had consumed his thoughts and shaped his destiny was moving from theoretical possibility into manifest reality. Soon, he would possess not merely political power over the galaxy's countless worlds, but the keys to transcendence itself. The soft chime of an arrival signal announced his master's approach. Palpatine composed his features into an expression of welcoming deference, though behind his eyes burned the fires of a hunger that had grown beyond all mortal proportions. Tonight, Darth Plagueis, the wise, would learn the final lesson in the manipulation of life and death, and his apprentice would take the first step toward a form of immortality that even the ancient Sith had barely dared to imagine. The door opened with the whisper of perfectly balanced mechanisms, and the future Emperor prepared to bid farewell to the last being in the galaxy who might have understood the true magnitude of what was about to unfold. The Force Storm prophecy demanded sacrifice, and tonight, that sacrifice would be offered with all the ceremony and reverence that such a momentous occasion deserved. In the hushed elegance of Naboo's most exclusive districts, where the wealthy and powerful gathered to celebrate their triumphs away from the scrutinizing eyes of the public, a private banquet hall glowed with the warm radiance of crystal chandeliers and the soft murmur of cultivated conversation. The gathering had been arranged to commemorate the successful resolution of the Trade Federation crisis. Though the guest list was limited to those beings whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any single world or system, Darth Plagueis moved through the assembled dignitaries with the fluid grace that had made him legendary in the galaxy's most exclusive financial circles. To the senators and corporate executives who formed the evening's company, he was simply Higo Damask, a munalanced banking magnate whose insights into galactic economics had shaped trade policy for decades. None suspected that beneath his cultivated exterior lay one of the most powerful practitioners of the dark side in recorded history. His host for the evening, Chancellor Palpatine, guided conversations with the skilled touch of a master politician, ensuring that each guest felt valued while simultaneously advancing subtle agendas that would serve the emerging empire's needs. But those who knew how to read the deeper currents of Force energy would have detected something unusual in the evening's atmosphere, a tension that ran beneath the surface of diplomatic pleasantries like an underground river approaching a waterfall. The banquet proceeded through multiple courses, each dish prepared with ingredients selected not merely for their culinary excellence, but for their symbolic significance to those who understood the hidden meaning of the occasion. Wines from worlds that had felt the touch of ancient Sith presence, fruits that grew only in soils enriched by the minerals of long-dead stars, delicacies that carried within their molecular structure the essence of cosmic forces that most beings never suspected existed. As the evening progressed and the formal portion of the gathering drew to a close, Palpatine guided his master toward a private chamber that adjoined the main hall. The other guests would assume that the two munalanced natives were conducting some complex financial negotiation. But the reality was far more profound than any mere business transaction. The private chamber had been prepared with the same attention to detail that Palpatine brought to all his most significant endeavors. Ancient tapestries depicting scenes from forgotten myths hung from walls that had been treated with compounds designed to enhance the resonance of Force energies. The lighting came from sources that seemed to burn with their own internal fire, casting shadows that danced with unusual patterns, and creating an atmosphere that existed somewhere between the physical world and the realm of dreams. Plagueis settled into a chair that had been crafted from the wood of trees that had grown in the Force-saturated soils of Dagobah, his elongated form appearing almost spectral in the chamber's unusual illumination. He accepted a glass of wine that Palpatine offered with the gracious manner of a being who had never learned to suspect treachery from those closest to him, a fatal flaw in one who had dedicated his existence to the pursuit of power through deception and manipulation. "My dear apprentice," the moon began, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection, mixed with the subtle condescension that characterized all his interactions with beings he considered his intellectual inferiors. "This evening has proven most illuminating. Your handling of the Trade Federation crisis was masterful, and I find myself increasingly impressed by your ability to extract advantage from apparent chaos." Palpatine inclined his head with appropriate humility, though his eyes reflected depths that his master had never fully fathomed. "I have learned from the most accomplished teacher in the galaxy," he replied, his tone carrying just the right blend of gratitude and ambition. "Your insights into the manipulation of galactic economics provided the foundation for everything I have achieved." They spoke for some time of markets and governments, of the subtle ways in which fear and greed could be leveraged to reshape the political landscape of entire sectors. But beneath their words, deeper currents were flowing, energies that responded to intentions and possibilities that transcended conventional understanding of power and influence. The wine they shared had been treated with compounds that enhanced sensitivity to Force energies while simultaneously dulling the reflexes that might otherwise detect incoming threats. Plagueis, secure in his assumption of superiority and lulled by decades of unchallenged dominance over his apprentice, failed to notice the gradual changes in his body's responses as the evening progressed. When the moment finally arrived, it came with the quiet inevitability of a tide reaching its highest point. Palpatine's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, applying pressure to specific points on his master's physiology, while simultaneously flooding the chamber with dark side energies that had been carefully prepared and focused through the room's hidden mechanisms. Plagueis felt the attack not as violence, but as revelation, a sudden understanding that his apprentice had transcended the relationship that had defined their interactions for so many years. Through the haze of approaching dissolution, he glimpsed something in Palpatine's expression that spoke of knowledge acquired independently, of connections made to sources of power that had remained hidden even from his exhaustive research. The prophecy, the dying moon whispered, his voice barely audible above the soft crackling of the chamber's unusual flames. You found more than you revealed. Palpatine leaned closer, his face illuminated by energies that seemed to come from within rather than from any external source. I found what you never could have understood, he replied, his words carrying the weight of cosmic certainty. Immortality is not the preservation of what exists, it is the transformation into what has never been. As life faded from his master's eyes, the new Dark Lord of the Sith felt the Force itself shift around him like a vast organism adjusting to changed circumstances. The death of one who had manipulated the very essence of life created ripples that would propagate across the galaxy for decades to come, preparing the cosmic substrate for the greater transformations that lay ahead. The obsidian fragments hidden throughout the chamber began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that had remained dormant for millennia, their ancient inscriptions glowing with renewed purpose as they sensed the approach of the prophecy's fulfillment. The Stormbearer had been born, the first wound was being prepared, and now the knowledge needed to guide the ritual was concentrated in a single will that would brook no interference from lesser visions of transcendence. Palpatine stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by artifacts that bore witness to the galaxy's hidden history, and felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow. The death he had just caused was not mere murder, but sacrament, the first true note in a symphony that would ultimately reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. Through the chamber's windows, the lights of Coruscant's endless city sparkled like scattered diamonds, each point of radiance representing millions of lives that would soon be touched by the consequences of this night's work. The Forestorm prophecy was no longer a theoretical possibility, but an approaching reality, and its chosen vessel was already beginning to show the signs of the spiritual resonance that would make him capable of tearing holes in the fabric of reality itself. The galaxy's fate had been sealed with a quiet conversation and a glass of wine, and somewhere in the desert wastes of Tatooine, a young slave named Anakin Skywalker felt a disturbance in the Force that would haunt his dreams for years to come. In the depths of Coruscant's most ancient foundations, where the accumulated weight of civilization pressed down through layer upon layer of forgotten construction, Emperor Palpatine descended through passages that had been old when the Jedi Temple was first erected on the planet's surface. These catacombs predated the Republic itself, carved from bedrock by hands that had known the galaxy when it was younger and stranger, when the boundaries between dimensions were more fluid and the Force spoke in languages that modern practitioners had forgotten how to hear. The Emperor's footsteps echoed through corridors lined with stone that had been quarried from the shattered worlds of the Old Republic's first wars, each block carrying within its crystalline structure the accumulated resonance of 1,000 battlefields. The air grew thick with the scent of deep places and ancient machinery, systems that had been installed by builders whose understanding of cosmic forces exceeded anything achieved by the current galactic civilization. Here, in chambers that had been sealed since before the rise of the Jedi Order, Palpatine had constructed his most secret workshop, a place where the obsidian prophecies could be studied without fear of detection, where artifacts too dangerous for any public repository could be safely stored and activated. The Force moved differently in these depths, following currents that had been deliberately shaped by architectural techniques that modern engineers would have dismissed as impossible. The Emperor paused at a circular chamber whose walls bore inscriptions in scripts that spanned millennia of Sith history. Each carving had been personally selected and positioned according to calculations derived from the Force-Storm prophecy, creating a three-dimensional mandala that could focus spiritual energies with unprecedented precision. At the chamber's center, a raised dais supported an array of artifacts that represented the accumulated knowledge of a dozen vanished civilizations. The first of the Ritual-S required instruments rested within a case of transparent steel that had been treated with compounds designed to contain Force energies that might otherwise prove destructive to ordinary matter. The Dathomir smoke mirror appeared to be nothing more than a disk of polished volcanic glass, but its surface held depths that seemed to extend far beyond its physical dimensions. When activated by the proper applications of dark side energy, it could serve as a window into probability streams that had not yet crystallized into actual events. Beside it, suspended in a field of controlled electromagnetic radiation, hung the Malachor Kyber lattice, a crystalline structure that had been grown in the Force-saturated ruins of that legendary world, its faceted surface still bearing the spiritual resonance of the fucking ancient weapon that had torn a hole in the galaxy's consciousness. The lattice could serve as a lens through which the raw energies of creation and destruction could be focused with surgical precision. The third component of the focusing array was perhaps the most unusual, a Lothal-coated lens that had been crafted by artisans who understood the mathematical relationships between music and cosmic harmony. Its surface was inscribed with notation that described the fundamental frequencies at which the Force itself vibrated, allowing it to translate spiritual energies into patterns that could be directly manipulated by conscious will. Each artifact had required years of careful acquisition, their gathering involving networks of smugglers, treasure hunters, and dealers in forbidden knowledge that stretched across multiple sectors of the galaxy. But their true value lay not in their individual properties, but in their combined potential. When properly aligned and activated, they would serve as the three mirrors that the prophecy required, capable of reflecting and amplifying the Stormbearer's spiritual resonance until it reached the critical intensity needed to tear holes in the veil between dimensions. The Emperor activated a series of hidden mechanisms that caused the chamber's walls to iris open, revealing additional spaces that extended the underground complex in directions that seemed to violate the conventional laws of geometry. Here, other components of the great work waited in carefully controlled environments. Star maps that charted the cosmic alignments needed for the Ritual-S success. Focusing crystals that had been grown in zero-gravity environments to achieve perfect harmonic resonance. and computing devices that blended advanced technology with force-enhanced consciousness to calculate probability. Matrices of staggering complexity. At the complex's heart lay the most crucial component of all, the observatory that would allow him to monitor and guide the Stormbearer's development across the years that lay ahead. Banks of sensors that could detect force disturbances across interstellar distances were connected to analysis systems that could track the emotional and spiritual states of specific individuals with unprecedented precision. Through this apparatus, the Emperor would be able to observe every significant moment in Anakin Skywalker's journey toward his destiny, ensuring that each crucial decision aligned with the prophecy's requirements. The boy's training as a Jedi would serve the prophecy's needs perfectly, providing him with the skills and knowledge necessary to channel the cosmic forces he would eventually be called upon to manipulate. But more importantly, the Jedi path would also expose him to the philosophical conflicts and emotional attachments that would create the wounds the ritual required. Love, fear, and betrayal would be woven into the fabric of his existence with such subtlety that he would never suspect how carefully his fate was being orchestrated. The Emperor smiled as he contemplated the elegance of the design he had spent decades perfecting. The Stormbearer would believe himself to be making free choices, would experience genuine emotions, and form authentic relationships, never knowing that every significant event in his life had been calculated to serve a greater purpose. The Jedi would train him in the use of powers that would ultimately be turned against everything they represented, while his own compassionate nature would provide the emotional resonance needed to fuel the ritual's success through hidden passages that connected his underground complex to the Jedi Temple itself. Sensors and monitoring devices fed a constant stream of information to the Emperor's analysis systems. He could track Anakin's progress in his studies, monitor his relationships with his fellow Padawans, and observe the gradual development of the attachments that would eventually provide the keys to his transformation. The first wound was already being prepared through subtle manipulations of circumstance and timing. The boy's mother remained on Tatooine, vulnerable to the kind of tragedy that would provide the initial crack in his spiritual armor. When the moment was right, when his training had progressed to the point where he possessed the power to act on his emotions, but lacked the wisdom to control them, events would be arranged to force him back to the desert world where his innocence would be forever shattered. The Emperor moved through his hidden sanctum like a composer reviewing the score of a symphony whose performance would span decades. Each movement had been carefully planned, each crescendo precisely timed to build upon the resonances that had come before. The Stormbearer would experience genuine growth and achievement, real friendship and authentic love, but all of it would serve to prepare him for the moment when those very blessings would be transformed into the instruments of his own destruction. In the deepest chamber of the complex, where the force currents ran strongest and the barriers between dimensions grew thin, the Emperor kept his most precious treasures, the complete collection of obsidian, fragments that contained the full text of the Forestorm prophecy. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had transcended mortality itself, he would spend the coming years in preparation for the ritual that would transform him from a mere galactic ruler into something that had never before existed in the known universe. The prophecy spoke of a ninefold gate, a sequence of alignments and transformations that would open a permanent passage between the realm of the living and the luminous mystery that lay beyond death. Through that gate, consciousness itself could travel, unbound by the limitations of physical form or the constraints of linear time. It was immortality, not as preservation, but as transcendence, a metamorphosis that would make gods of those who possessed the knowledge and courage to attempt it. The Emperor's laughter echoed through the ancient chambers as he contemplated the magnificence of what lay ahead. Soon, very soon, the first movement of his great symphony would begin, and the galaxy would start its journey toward a transformation that would echo throughout eternity. The desert winds of Tatooine carried more than sand across the endless dunes. They bore the weight of destiny itself. Invisible currents of possibility that swirled around the modest moisture farm where Anakin Skywalker had grown from the Force-touched child of prophecy into a young man whose very presence made the fabric of reality tremble with anticipation. Here, beneath twin suns that painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the first movement of the cosmic symphony that Palpatine had orchestrated for so many years was about to reach its crescendo. The Lars homestead sat like a cluster of weathered domes against the horizon, its humble architecture reflecting the practical needs of beings who had learned to survive in one of the galaxy's most inhospitable environments. But beneath the surface of this simple farming operation, deeper currents were stirring, currents that connected this remote world to the vast mechanisms of fate that governed the rise and fall of civilizations. In the depths of Coruscant's hidden chambers, the Emperor felt the cosmic alignments shifting like tectonic plates in the Force itself. His instruments detected the subtle changes in Anakin's spiritual resonance as the young Jedi approached the moment of his first true test, the experience that would carve the initial wound into his soul and begin the process of transformation that would ultimately make him suitable for the prophecy's demands. The manipulation had been exquisitely subtle, requiring the coordination of agents and circumstances across multiple star systems. Pirates had been encouraged to increase their raids on the Outer Rim territories. Slave traders had been provided with information about vulnerable targets. Local authorities had been distracted by crises that demanded their immediate attention elsewhere. All of these seemingly unrelated events had been carefully orchestrated to create the conditions that would bring tragedy to Shmi Skywalker and her son racing back to Tatooine in time to witness its aftermath. The Emperor's smile was cold as starlight as he observed the approaching convergence through his network of hidden sensors. The boy's journey home would appear to be motivated by genuine concern for his mother's welfare, by the kind of compassionate attachment that the Jedi Code warned against but could never entirely eliminate from the hearts of its most promising students. But in reality, every aspect of his return had been calculated to maximize the psychological impact of what he would discover upon his arrival through the Force. Palpatine could sense the precise moment when Anakin first felt the disturbance that would draw him back to his birth world. The young Jedi was deep in meditation within the Jedi Temple. His consciousness expanded into the cosmic currents that connected all living things when the wave of anguish emanating from Tatooine struck him like a physical blow. The Emperor watched with satisfaction as his instruments recorded the sudden spike in the boy's emotional resonance, the first crack appearing in the carefully maintained serenity that his Jedi training had attempted to instill. The journey to Tatooine passed in a blur of hyperspace calculations and growing anxiety, each parsec bringing Anakin closer to the destiny that had been prepared for him since the moment of his conception. His companions, Padma and C-3P, O provided emotional anchors that would make the coming revelation all the more painful. Witnesses whose presence would amplify the significance of his actions and bind him more deeply to the pattern of choices that would ultimately lead to his transformation. The moisture farm appeared unchanged as their transport settled onto the desert floor, its familiar silhouette offering false comfort to a young man whose enhanced senses were already detecting the emanations of violence and loss that hung over the homestead like a poisonous cloud. The Emperor's instruments recorded every nuance of Anakin's emotional state as he approached the dwelling where his stepfather waited with news that would shatter his world. Owen Lars met them at the entrance with the grim expression of a man who had seen too much suffering in too short a time. His words fell like stones into still water, each syllable creating ripples that would propagate through the years ahead. The Tusken Raiders had taken Shmi, had held her for weeks while her family searched desperately for any trace of her location, had finally been discovered too late to prevent the tragedy that would haunt her son for the rest of his life. The Emperor felt a deep satisfaction as his sensors detected the first true stirring of the storm that lay dormant within Anakin's consciousness. The boy's grief was genuine, his love for his mother authentic, but both emotions served the prophecy's requirements perfectly. The Force storm could only be awakened through genuine anguish, through the kind of spiritual pain that transcended mere physical suffering and touched the fundamental structures of existence itself. Anakin's journey into the desert followed paths that had been subtly influenced by the Emperor's agents over the course of many months. The Tusken camp had been established in a location that maximized both the dramatic impact of its discovery and the likelihood that the young Jedi's rescue attempt would arrive just moments too late to save his mother's life. Every detail had been calculated to produce the precise emotional resonance that the ritual required. The Emperor's hidden observers recorded the scene that unfolded within the primitive shelter where Shmi Skywalker breathed her last in her son's arms. The moment of her death created a disturbance in the Force that rippled across star systems, a psychic scream that announced the birth of something new and terrible in the galaxy's spiritual ecosystem. Through his network of sensors, Palpatine felt the first stirring of the maelstrom that would ultimately serve as his gateway to transcendence. What followed was massacre, but massacre transformed by Force energies into something approaching ritual significance. Anakin's lightsaber became an instrument of cosmic purpose as he moved through the Tusken camp like an avatar of righteous fury, each strike releasing energies that had been building within him since childhood. The Emperor's instruments detected the precise moment when grief transformed into rage, when the young Jedi's carefully maintained moral boundaries shattered under the weight of unbearable loss. The slaughter was complete and methodical, encompassing not only the warriors who had participated in his mother's capture, but their families, their children, their entire way of life. With each death, the storm within Anakin's consciousness grew stronger, feeding on the dark emotions that poured from his wounded soul like blood from an arterial wound. The Force itself seemed to recoil from the violence, then adapt to accommodate the new patterns of energy that were being established through the young man's actions. In his hidden sanctuary beneath Coruscant, the Emperor felt the Dathomiri smoke mirror begin to resonate with harmonic frequencies that had remained dormant for decades. The first of the 3 required wounds had been opened. The initial crack in the Stormbearer's spiritual armor that would allow the prophecy's energies to take root and begin their work of transformation. The boy's innocence was gone forever, replaced by a knowledge of his own capacity for darkness that would color every choice he made for the remainder of his life. The aftermath of the massacre saw Anakin kneeling in the sand beside his mother's funeral pyre, his consciousness reeling from the magnitude of what he had done and felt. But the Emperor's instruments detected something else in the young man's Force signature, fundamental change in the way he related to the cosmic energies that surrounded all living things. The storm had awakened, and though it remained small and controllable for now, it carried within it the potential to grow into something that could reshape the galaxy itself. Palpatine smiled as he observed the readings flowing from his hidden sensors, noting the way Anakin's emotional patterns now included harmonics that resonated with the ancient frequencies described in the Obsidian prophecies. The first movement of his great symphony had concluded exactly as planned, and the second movement was already beginning to take shape in the quantum foam of possibility that surrounded all significant choices. The boy would return to Coruscant, carrying the weight of his actions like a stone in his heart, never suspecting that his grief and rage had served a purpose far greater than mere revenge. The first wound had been carved into his soul with surgical precision, and in the years ahead, that wound would be carefully tended and nurtured until it became capable of generating the peekaboo energies needed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The Stormbearer had tasted darkness and found it intoxicating, and though he would struggle against that attraction for years to come, the Emperor knew that the struggle itself would only serve to strengthen the forces that would ultimately consume him. The Force Storm prophecy was no longer a theoretical possibility but a growing reality, and its chosen vessel was beginning to develop the resonance that would make him capable of serving as a gateway to transcendence. In the elegant depths of the galaxy's opera house, where the wealthy and cultured of Coruscant gathered to witness artistic performances that spoke to the deepest mysteries of existence, Chancellor Palpatine settled into his private box with the quiet satisfaction of a being who had learned to find profound pleasure in the patient manipulation of fate. The aquatic ballet, unfolding bellowy ethereal creatures, moving through liquid medium with grace that transcended the merely physical, provided a perfect metaphor for the delicate work he was conducting with the Stormbearer's developing consciousness. Beside him, Anakin Skywalker watched the performance with the distracted attention of a young man whose thoughts were consumed by concerns that had nothing to do with artistic appreciation. The Jedi Knight's face, illuminated by the soft bioluminescence of the aquatic performers, bore the subtle signs of strain that came from trying to maintain serenity while wrestling with fears that grew stronger with each passing day. His love for Padme had deepened into something approaching obsession, and with it had come the terrible certainty that he would lose her just as he had lost his mother. Beside him, Anakin Skywalker watched the performance with the distracted attention of a young man whose thoughts were consumed by concerns that had nothing to do with artistic appreciation. The Jedi Knight's face, illuminated by the soft bioluminescence of the aquatic performers, bore the subtle signs of strain that came from trying to maintain serenity while wrestling with fears that grew stronger with each passing day. His love for Padme had deepened into something approaching obsession, and with it had come the terrible certainty that he would lose her just as he had lost his mother. The Emperor's enhanced senses detected the precise emotional frequencies radiating from his young friend, noting how they had evolved since that fateful night on Tatooine when the first wound had been carved into his soul. The grief and rage of his mother's death had matured into something more complex and potentially more usefully. Deep-seated terror of loss that colored every aspect of his relationships with those he cared about most deeply. "You seem troubled, my young friend Palpatine," murmured, his voice pitched to carry just the right blend of concern and understanding. "The weight of war bears heavily on all of us, but I sense that your burdens are more personal in nature." Anakin's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a sign that the Chancellor's words had struck closer to the truth than the young Jedi was comfortable acknowledging. The Emperor had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of his chosen vessel's emotional state, studying the way fear and love intertwined in his consciousness to create exactly the kind of spiritual resonance that the prophecy required. "I've been having dreams," Anakin admitted quietly, his voice barely audible above the soft music that accompanied the aquatic performance. "Visions of ... of loss, of people I care about suffering, while I stand helpless to prevent it." The Emperor nodded with the grave understanding of a mentor who had witnessed such struggles countless times before. But beneath his compassionate exterior, he felt a thrill of satisfaction as he recognized the symptoms of the second wound beginning to manifest. The prophecy spoke of 3 spiritual injuries that would prepare the Stormbearer for his ultimate transformation: fear transmuted into rage, love poisoned by the certainty of loss, and the final betrayal of one's deepest principles. "Such visions can be manifestations of the Force," Palpatine said carefully, allowing his voice to carry the weight of hard-won wisdom. "But they can also be reflections of our own deepest fears, given form by a mind that has learned to anticipate loss as the inevitable consequence of attachment." The performance below them reached a crescendo of movement and light, the aquatic dancers weaving patterns that seemed to echo the cosmic harmonies described in the ancient Sith texts. But the Emperor's attention was focused entirely on the young man beside him, watching for the precise moment when philosophical discussion could be transformed into something approaching religious instruction. "The Jedi teachings speak much of letting go," Anakin said, his words carrying a bitterness that revealed the depth of his struggle with the Order's central precepts. "But how can anyone simply release their hold on those who give meaning to existence itself? How can love be reconciled with the demand for emotional detachment?" It was exactly the opening that Palpatine had been waiting for. The moment when the Stormbearer's philosophical foundations had been weakened enough to accept alternative perspectives on the nature of power and transcendence. The Emperor leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the intimate tone of a teacher sharing secrets that had been hard-won through personal experience. "Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning the gap between light and shadow, between the limited vision of the Jedi and the profound understanding that came from embracing the deeper mysteries of the Force. Anakin shook his head, his attention now fully focused on his mentor's words. "I thought not," Palpatine continued, his voice taking on the cadence of ritual recitation, each syllable weighted with significance that transcended mere storytelling. "It's not a story the Jedi would tell you. It's a Sith legend." The Emperor's words were more than narrative, they were incantation, each phrase carefully chosen to resonate with the spiritual frequencies that the Obsidian prophecies had identified as necessary for the awakening of the Force storm. As he spoke of Plagueis and his research into the manipulation of life itself, he was simultaneously weaving a web of possibility around Anakin's consciousness, creating pathways through which the young man's deepest fears could be transformed into instruments of cosmic significance. Darth Plagueis was a dark lord of the Sith, so powerful and so wise he could use the Force to influence the midichlorians to create life. He had such a knowledge of the dark side that he could even keep the ones he cared about from dying. The words struck Anakin like physical blows, each revelation opening new vistas of possibility that the Jedi teachings had insisted were impossible. The Emperor watched with satisfaction as his sensors detected the precise moment when hope began to kindle in the young man's consciousness, not the serene hope of Jedi philosophy, but the desperate, grasping hope of someone who had glimpsed a way to prevent the losses that haunted his dreams. He could actually save people from death, Anakin whispered, his voice carrying a hunger that went far beyond mere curiosity. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural, Palpatine replied, allowing his words to carry both promise and warning. He became so powerful that the only thing he was afraid of was losing his power, which eventually, of course, he did. Unfortunately, he taught his apprentice everything he knew. Then his apprentice killed him in his sleep. The irony was, Exquisite Emperor was describing his own actions while simultaneously using them to illustrate the very principles that would ultimately lead to Anakin's transformation. The young Jedi's face reflected the complex emotions that were warring within his consciousness. Fascination with the possibilities that the story described, horror at the implications of such power, and beneath it all, the growing certainty that he would do anything, sacrifice anything, to prevent the loss of those he loved. Is it possible to learn this power? Anakin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Emperor paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle around them like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow. Below them, the aquatic performance reached its conclusion, the dancers spiraling into formations that seemed to echo the cosmic alignments necessary for the prophecy's fulfillment. The Force itself seemed to hold its breath as the future of the galaxy balanced on the edge of a single word. Not from a Jedi, Palpatine said finally, his voice carrying the finality of absolute truth. The second wound had been opened, carved into Anakin's consciousness with the surgical precision of a master manipulator who understood exactly how to transform love into desperation, hope into obsession. The young Jedi's spiritual resonance had shifted into new harmonic frequencies, patterns that would grow stronger with each passing day until they reached the critical intensity needed to serve the prophecy's requirements. As they sat in the gathering darkness of the opera house, surrounded by the fading echoes of artistic beauty, the Emperor felt the Malachor Kyber lattice responding to the changes in the Stormbearer's consciousness. The second of the three required mirrors was beginning to awaken, preparing to focus and amplify the energies that would ultimately tear holes in the veil between dimensions. The performance was ending, but the true drama was just beginning. Soon, very soon, the final act of the cosmic symphony would commence, and the galaxy would witness the birth of something that had never before existed in the known universe. The Stormbearer had been prepared, the wounds had been opened, and the pathway to transcendence was beginning to reveal itself through the quantum foam of possibility that surrounded all moments of profound transformation. In the vast emptiness between star systems, where the normal laws of physics gave way to anomalies that defied conventional understanding, a nexus of force energy pulsed with rhythms that had remained constant since the galaxy's youth. The Mortis system existed outside the regular flow of space and time, a pocket dimension where the fundamental forces of existence took physical form and played out dramas that shaped the destiny of countless worlds. Here, in a realm where concepts like balance and dominion and sacrifice walked the landscape as living beings, the Emperor's consciousness reached out through techniques that transcended conventional methods of perception. The Dathomir smoke mirror, properly attuned and focused through rituals that had been perfected over decades of careful study, served as a window into probability streams that existed beyond the boundaries of linear causality. Through this mystical apparatus, Palpatine could observe the cosmic mechanisms that governed the interaction between light and shadow, could witness the eternal struggle between order and chaos that played out on scales both cosmic and intimate. The beings who inhabited Mortis, the Father, the Son, and the Daughter, represented forces that had been active since the universe first learned to dream, and their conflicts provided crucial insights into the nature of the transformation that the Force Storm prophecy promised. The Emperor's hidden sanctuary beneath Coruscant hummed with energies that responded to the images flowing through the smoke mirror's surface. He saw the Father, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, struggling to maintain the balance between his children, whose posing natures threatened to tear apart the very fabric of existence. He witnessed the Son's hunger for dominion, his desire to reshape the galaxy according to his vision of perfect order through absolute power, and he observed the Daughter's commitment to preservation, her determination to protect life and light from the consuming darkness that her brother represented. But most importantly, he saw how their eternal conflict created resonances in the Force that could be detected and utilized by those who possessed sufficient knowledge and skill. The Mortis Nexus was like a cosmic tuning fork, generating harmonic frequencies that could be used to calibrate the instruments needed for the prophecy's fulfillment. Through careful study of these patterns, the Emperor was learning to understand the precise conditions under which the veil between dimensions could be weakened and ultimately penetrated. The visions revealed truths that went far beyond the limited understanding of either Jedi or traditional Sith philosophy. The Force was not simply an energy field that surrounded and penetrated all living things. It was a conscious entity with its own will and purpose, a cosmic intelligence that operated according to principles that mortals could glimpse but never fully comprehend. The eternal struggle between light and shadow was not a conflict to be resolved, but a creative tension that generated the very conditions necessary for existence itself. Through the smoke mirror's revelations, Palpatine began to understand why the ancient Sith had spoken of the Force Storm in terms that blended scientific precision with religious reverence. The phenomenon they described was not merely a technique for manipulating energy, but a way of harmonizing with the fundamental frequencies at which reality itself vibrated. To successfully open a permanent gateway between dimensions would require not just raw power, but perfect attunement to the cosmic rhythms that governed the interaction between existence and the void that surrounded it. The observations also revealed the crucial importance of the vessel's emotional resonance in determining the ritual's success. The beings of Mortis drew their power from the intensity of their commitment to their respective principles, the Father's dedication to balance, the Son's hunger for dominion, the Daughter's devotion to preservation. Similarly, the Stormbearer would need to achieve a level of emotional investment that transcended ordinary human capacity, a depth of feeling that could generate the spiritual energies needed to tear holes in the fabric of space-time itself. As the Emperor studied the Mortis visions, he began to understand the true significance of the 3 wounds that the prophecy demanded. They were not merely psychological injuries, but spiritual frequencies, harmonic patterns that would allow the vessel's consciousness to resonate with the cosmic forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of mortal existence. Fear, love, and betrayal were not emotions, but keys, specific frequencies that could unlock doorways that had remained sealed since the galaxy's youth. The father's struggles to maintain balance between his children provided crucial insights into the mechanism by which the 3rd wound would be opened. Betrayal was not simply the abandonment of principles, but the moment when competing loyalties created an irreconcilable conflict that could only be resolved through the complete transformation of the individual caught between them. The Stormbearer would need to be placed in a position where his deepest commitments came into direct opposition, where choosing one path necessarily meant destroying everything he had previously held sacred. Through the smoke mirror's visions, the Emperor saw glimpses of possible futures, probability streams that showed various ways in which the final confrontation might unfold. In some timelines, the vessel proved incapable of generating the necessary emotional intensity, remaining trapped by conventional notions of morality and restraint. In others, the transformation succeeded but consumed everything in its path, creating a spiritual catastrophe that rendered the entire exercise meaningless. But in a select few probability streams, the Emperor observed outcomes that perfectly matched the prophecy's descriptions. He saw Anakin Skywalker standing at the center of a maelstrom of force energy that made the powers displayed on Mortis seem like candle flames compared to a blazing star. He witnessed the moment when the young man's spiritual resonance achieved perfect harmonic alignment with the cosmic frequencies that governed the boundary between life and death, creating a gateway through which consciousness itself could travel without the limitations imposed by physical form. The visions also revealed the crucial timing that would be required for the ritual's success. The cosmic alignments described in the Obsidian prophecies were not merely astronomical phenomena, but spiritual configurations, moments when the galaxy's consciousness achieved states of receptivity that occurred perhaps once in a millennium. The Emperor would need to orchestrate not just the vessel's transformation, but the precise moment when that transformation occurred, ensuring that all the necessary conditions converged at exactly the right instant. As the Mortis visions faded and the smoke mirror's surface returned to its normal reflective state, the Emperor felt a deep satisfaction settling over him like a comfortable robe. The knowledge he had gained from observing the cosmic nexus would allow him to complete the preparations for the prophecy's fulfillment with unprecedented precision. The Stormbearer's training was proceeding exactly as planned. The necessary wounds were being carefully cultivated, and the instruments needed to focus and channel the resulting energies were nearly ready for activation. Soon, very soon, the galaxy would witness the birth of something that transcended all previous categories of existence. The Emperor smiled as he contemplated the magnificence of what lay ahead, knowing that he stood on the threshold of a transformation that would echo throughout eternity. The Forstorm was gathering strength, and when it finally broke free from the constraints that had contained it for so many years, reality itself would be reshaped according to his will. In the hidden chambers, where ancient artifacts waited to serve purposes that their creators had only dimly imagined, the instruments of transcendence hummed with growing anticipation. The ninefold gate was beginning to take shape, and beyond it lay mysteries that even the Emperor had only begun to comprehend. Deep within the volcanic heart of Mustafar, where rivers of molten rock carved channels through landscapes that seemed torn from the nightmares of tortured worlds, the Emperor's consciousness reached out through the quantum foam of possibility to touch the approaching moment of cosmic significance. The lava flows that painted the planet's surface in shades of crimson and gold created more than mere geological spectacle. They generated the precise harmonic frequencies that the Force-storm prophecy required for its ultimate fulfillment. Here, in a star system that had been shaped by cataclysmic forces operating on scales that dwarfed ordinary stellar phenomena, the barriers between dimensions grew thin enough to be manipulated by those who possessed the knowledge and will to attempt such manipulations. The planet's core resonated with energies that predated the formation of the galactic disk itself. Primordial forces that had been waiting eons for the right combination of circumstances to awaken them from their cosmic slumber. The Emperor's calculations had identified Mustafar as the optimal location for the ritual's climax, not merely because of its isolated position far from the centers of galactic civilization, but because its unique geological and spiritual properties would serve as a natural amplifier for the energies that the Stormbearer would generate during his final transformation. The obsidian prophecies spoke of fire beneath the black sky, of crucibles where mortal flesh could be transmuted into something approaching divine essence. Through his network of hidden sensors and carefully placed agents, Palpatine began the delicate work of orchestrating the complex sequence of events that would bring all the necessary components together at precisely the right moment. The Separatist leadership would need to be gathered on Mustafar, not merely to provide targets for the vessel's blade work, but to create the specific pattern of violence and betrayal that would open the third and final wound in his spiritual armor. Each death would serve as a note in the cosmic symphony that the ritual required, and the Emperor had spent years studying the precise sequence of killings that would generate the optimal resonance patterns. The Separatist leaders represented different aspects of the galactic civilization that would need to be symbolically destroyed before the new order could emerge. Commerce, technology, military power, political authority. Their elimination would create ripples in the Force that extended far beyond their individual significance, preparing the cosmic substrate for the greater transformation that lay ahead. The timing of the ritual was crucial in ways that went beyond mere astronomical alignments. The Emperor's instruments had detected the precise moment when the galaxy's spiritual equilibrium would reach a critical instability, when the accumulated stress of years of warfare and manipulation would create conditions that could be exploited by those who understood the deeper mechanics of cosmic transformation. The Clone Wars had served their purpose not merely as a tool for political manipulation, but as a way of generating the psychic resonance that the prophecy required. Millions of deaths across hundreds of worlds had created a background of anguish and desperation that permeated the galaxy's consciousness, like the harmonies of a vast, discordant orchestra. Into this chaos, the Stormbearer's personal transformation would introduce new frequencies that could serve as a focusing lens, concentrating the galaxy's accumulated pain into energies that could be used to tear holes in the veil between dimensions. The Emperor smiled as he contemplated the elegance of the design he had spent decades perfecting. The vessel's journey to Mustafar would appear to be motivated by duty and necessity, the need to eliminate the separatist leadership and bring the Clone Wars to their ordained conclusion. But in reality, every aspect of his mission had been calculated to maximize the spiritual significance of the actions he would perform there. The lightsaber that Anakin carried would serve as more than a weapon during the ritual. It would become a conductor's baton, an instrument through which the cosmic energies generated by his emotional transformation could be focused and directed with unprecedented precision. Each strike against the separatist leaders would release force energies that had been building within his consciousness since childhood, creating the specific harmonic patterns that the prophecy required. But the true climax of the ritual would come not with the elimination of the separatists, but with the confrontation that would follow the moment when the vessel's deepest loyalties would be tested in the crucible of impossible choices. The Emperor's agents had already begun the delicate work of ensuring that Padme would arrive on Mustafar at precisely the right moment, bringing with her the emotional catalyst that would complete the vessel's transformation. The third wound betrayal could only be opened through actions that violated everything the Stormbearer believed about himself and his purposes. He would need to strike down not just enemies, but friends, to betray not just political alliances, but the fundamental principles that had shaped his identity since childhood. The psychological violence required to accomplish this transformation would generate spiritual energies that made the destructions he had already caused seem like mere whispers compared to cosmic thunder. Through his hidden instruments, the Emperor could observe the precise moment when all the necessary conditions would converge. The Lothal-coated lens, properly attuned and positioned, would serve as the third mirror in the ritual array, focusing the Stormbearer's emotional resonance into patterns that could penetrate the barriers between dimensions. The Malachor Kyber lattice would amplify these energies to levels that approached cosmic significance, while the Dathomir smoke mirror would serve as a window through which the transformation could be observed and guided. The Ninefold Gate was not a physical structure, but a sequence of alignment's three mirrors, activated by three keys at the precise moment when three wounds achieved perfect harmonic resonance. The keys were not objects, but states of consciousness, the acceptance of power over life and death, the willingness to sacrifice everything for love, and the complete abandonment of moral restraint in service of a greater purpose. As the moment of convergence approached, the Emperor felt the Force itself beginning to shift around him like a vast organism preparing for metamorphosis. The galaxy's consciousness was approaching a state of critical instability, a moment of perfect receptivity when the barriers between dimensions could be not merely penetrated but permanently breached. Through that breach, he would step into a form of existence that transcended all previous categories of mortal and immortal, becoming something that had never before existed in the known universe. The Stormbearer was almost ready, his spiritual resonance approaching the critical frequencies that the ritual required. Soon, very soon, the final act of the cosmic symphony would begin, and the galaxy would witness the birth of a new form of consciousness that could travel freely between the realm of the living and the luminous mystery that lay beyond death. The instruments of transcendence waited in their hidden chambers, humming with anticipation as the moment of their activation drew near. The Forstorm prophecy was no longer a theoretical possibility, but an approaching reality, and its fulfillment would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. In the shadowed chambers of the Jedi Temple, where the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 generations had been gathered and preserved against the darkness that perpetually threatened to engulf the galaxy chancellor, Palpatine moved with the measured grace of a being who had learned to find profound satisfaction in the patient orchestration of fate. The ornate corridors, their walls lined with statues of legendary masters, whose names had become synonymous with courage and wisdom, seemed to whisper with the voices of the past as he approached the chamber where the final act of his great drama would begin. The Jedi Council awaited him in their traditional circle, each master positioned according to hierarchies of authority and wisdom that had evolved over millennia of careful tradition. But the Emperor's enhanced senses detected something different in the room's atmosphere, tonight an undercurrent of tension and suspicion that spoke of decisions already made, of lines that were about to be crossed, with consequences that none of them fully understood. Master Windu's face bore the grim expression of a being who had spent years wrestling with doubts about the Republic's leadership, doubts that had finally crystallized into certainty about the Chancellor's true nature. Beside him, Master Yoda's ancient features reflected the weight of knowledge that had been hard-won through centuries of observing the ebb and flow of cosmic forces, while the other council members displayed varying degrees of resolve and uncertainty about the course of action they were contemplating. Chancellor Windu began, his voice carrying the formal tone that preceded official pronouncements of the gravest significance. In the name of the Galactic Senate of the Republic, you are under arrest. The words hung in the air between them like a blade poised to fall, creating a moment of perfect silence in which the future of the galaxy balanced on the edge of possibility. The Emperor felt a thrill of satisfaction as he recognized the precise instant when all his years of careful manipulation were about to bear fruit, when the Jedi themselves would provide the catalyst for the Stormbearer's final transformation. "Are you threatening me, Master Jedi?" Palpatine replied, his voice carrying just the right blend of wounded dignity and growing alarm. The performance was flawless, decades of political theater combining with deeper understanding of cosmic forces to create a moment that would resonate through the Force itself. The confrontation that followed unfolded exactly as the Emperor had foreseen, each exchange of words and lightsaber strikes serving to heighten the spiritual tensions that would soon explode into the energies needed for the prophecy's fulfillment. Through his network of hidden sensors, he could detect the precise moment when Anakin felt the disturbance and began racing toward the Chancellor's office, drawn by loyalties and fears that had been carefully cultivated over the course of many years. The lightsaber duel that erupted across the ornate chamber was more than mere combat, it was ritual. Each movement and counterstrike releasing Force energies that had been building toward this moment since the night Palpatine had first discovered the obsidian fragments beneath Theed. The ancient statues that lined the walls seemed to lean forward like spectators at some cosmic arena, their stone faces reflecting the play of crimson and blue light that danced across their weathered features. Master Windu's skill with the blade was legendary throughout the galaxy, his mastery of Form 7 allowing him to channel his own controlled aggression into techniques that could overwhelm even the most accomplished opponents. But the Emperor was fighting not merely for victory, but for the precise choreography that would create the emotional conditions necessary for Anakin's final transformation. Each apparent retreat, each moment of feigned weakness was calculated to ensure that the young Jedi would arrive at exactly the right instant to witness what appeared to be his mentor's imminent defeat. The crash of shattered transper steel and the acrid scent of melted metal filled the chamber as the duel reached its crescendo. Both combatants pushed to the limits of their abilities by the magnitude of what hung in the balance. Through the Force, the Emperor could sense Anakin's approach, could feel the complex mixture of fear, loyalty, and desperation that was driving the young man toward the chamber where his destiny awaited. When Windu finally gained the upper hand, standing over his fallen opponent with lightsaber raised for the killing blow, the moment had arrived for the final act of the performance that would determine the galaxy's fate. The Emperor's apparent helplessness was perfect theater, designed to trigger every protective instinct that had been carefully nurtured in his chosen vessel's psychology. "Please don't kill me," Palpatine gasped, his voice carrying just the right note of desperate pleading. "I'm too weak. Please don't." The door burst open at precisely the calculated instant, revealing Anakin silhouetted against the corridor's illumination like an avatar of conflicted destiny. His face reflected the anguish of a being caught between loyalties that had been deliberately crafted to be irreconcilable, between duty to the Jedi Order and devotion to the mentor who had promised salvation for those he loved. "He must live," Anakin cried, his voice carrying the weight of futures that hung in the balance. "I need him." The words were more than plea, they were incantation, the verbal key that would unlock the third and final wound in the Stormbearer's spiritual armor. Through his enhanced perception, the Emperor could feel the moment when absolute moral certainty gave way to desperate compromise, when the young Jedi's commitment to light began its transformation into something far more complex and dangerous. What followed was betrayal, distilled to its purest essence, the severing of bonds that had been forged through years of training and shared ideals. Anakin's lightsaber removed Windu's sword hand with surgical precision, creating the opening that allowed the Emperor to unleash the Force lightning that would complete the Jedi Master's destruction. But more importantly, it created the spiritual rupture that would allow the storm within Anakin's consciousness to break free from the constraints that had contained it since childhood. The third wound had been opened with perfect precision, carved into the young man's soul through actions that violated everything he had believed about himself and his purposes. The Emperor felt the lawful-coded lens responding to the change in the Stormbearer's spiritual resonance, beginning to focus energies that had been building for decades into patterns that could tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. "Power, unlimited power," the Emperor cried as Force lightning filled the chamber with crackling energy. But his words carried significance that went far beyond the mere destruction of a single opponent. The true power that was being unleashed was cosmic in scope, the awakening of forces that could reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. As Windu's lifeless form tumbled through the shattered window into Coruscant's urban abyss, the galaxy felt a disturbance that went beyond the death of a single Jedi Master. The Force itself seemed to recoil and then adapt, accommodating new patterns of energy that had not existed since the ancient days when the barriers between dimensions were more permeable and consciousness could travel freely between states of existence. Anakin knelt before his new master with the desperate submission of a being who had sacrificed everything for the promise of salvation, never suspecting that his apparent salvation was actually the key to a transformation that would make him capable of serving as a gateway to transcendence. The third wound had been opened, the final frequency had been achieved, and the storm that had been gathering within his consciousness for so many years was finally ready to break free. The Emperor smiled as he felt the cosmic alignments shifting into their final configuration, the ninefold gate beginning to take shape in the quantum foam of possibility that surrounded all moments of profound transformation. Soon, very soon, the galaxy would witness the birth of something that had never before existed in the known universe. And the first movement of a new age would begin with the sound of a young man's lightsaber, igniting in the service of darkness. Across the galaxy's civilized worlds, in the temples and meditation chambers, where the Jedi had maintained their vigil against the darkness for over 1,000 generations, the Force itself seemed to hold its breath as the moment of ultimate betrayal approached. The Emperor's voice, transmitted through encoded channels to clone commanders who had been programmed for this moment since their creation, carried words that would transform the galactic landscape with surgical precision and devastating completeness. Execute Order 60. The command rippled through hyperspace communication networks like a stone dropped into still water, reaching clone troopers who had fought beside their Jedi generals through years of warfare, who had shared victories and defeats, triumphs and sorrows, never suspecting that their loyalty had been engineered to serve a purpose far more profound than mere military efficiency. In an instant that spanned parsecs and encompassed thousands of worlds, brotherhood became betrayal, trust became treachery, and the galaxy's spiritual guardians found themselves facing annihilation at the hands of those they had considered family. Through his network of hidden sensors, the Emperor observed the systematic elimination of the Jedi Order with an attention to detail that went far beyond mere tactical interest. Each death created ripples in the Force that contributed to the vast symphony of anguish and disruption he had been orchestrating for decades, building toward a crescendo of cosmic significance that would provide the perfect conditions for the Stormbearer's final transformation. On Mygito, where crystalline formations created natural amplifiers for Force energies, Master Kiadamundi fell beneath the concentrated fire of troopers he had led through a dozen campaigns. The Syrian's death created harmonic resonances that propagated through the planet's unique geological structures, contributing specific frequencies to the growing pattern of cosmic disruption that the ritual required. On Felucia, where the jungle's bioluminescent flora had been shaped by millennia of force saturation, Aayla Secura's passing sent shockwaves through ecosystems that had evolved in response to Jedi presence. The symbiotic relationships between conscious beings and their environment, carefully nurtured through generations of patient cultivation, were severed in an instant, creating a void in the living Force that would take centuries to heal. On Cato Neimoidia, where the bridges and spires of impossible architecture defied conventional understanding of engineering and physics, Plo Koon's fighter craft plummeted through layers of atmospheric disturbance that reflected the spiritual chaos engulfing the galaxy. The Keldor Master's connection to the cosmic winds had made him sensitive to atmospheric phenomena across multiple star systems, and his death created a silence in patterns of air and energy that had remained constant for eons. Each execution was more than individual tragedy, was the severing of connections that had bound the galaxy's consciousness together in ways that most beings never suspected existed. The Jedi served not merely as peacekeepers and mediators, but as focal points for cosmic energies, their disciplined minds creating stability in the chaotic currents of the Force that surrounded all living things. Their sudden removal created a spiritual vacuum that demanded to be filled, generating exactly the kind of instability that the Force Storm prophecy required for its fulfillment. In the hidden chambers beneath Coruscant, where the Emperor's most secret instruments waited to serve their ultimate purpose, the Dathomiri smoke mirror began to resonate with frequencies that had remained dormant since the ancient days when the Sith had first learned to tear holes in the boundaries between dimensions. The systematic destruction of the Jedi Order was creating harmonic patterns in the Force that matched the requirements specified in the Obsidian prophecies, preparing the cosmic substrate for the greater transformation that lay ahead. The silence that followed the completion of Order 66 was more profound than mere absence of sound. It was the hush that comes after a vast orchestra suddenly stops playing, leaving listeners straining to hear echoes of melodies that had shaped their understanding of harmony itself. Across the galaxy, Force-sensitive beings felt the disturbance as a physical blow, a sensation of fundamental wrongness that spoke of patterns disrupted and balances destroyed. But for the Emperor, the silence was not an ending but a beginning. The moment when the stage had been cleared for the final act of the cosmic drama he had spent decades orchestrating. With the Jedi eliminated, the Stormbearer's transformation could proceed without interference from those who might have recognized the true significance of what was occurring and attempted to prevent its completion. The first mirror, the Dathomiri smoke glass, had achieved perfect resonance with the galaxy's new spiritual configuration. The deaths of the Jedi had created precisely the kind of cosmic disturbance that the ritual required, generating chaotic energies that could be focused and channeled through the proper application of ancient techniques. The vessel's emotional state was approaching the critical instability that would allow him to serve as a gateway between dimensions. Through his network of agents and monitoring devices, the Emperor could observe the Stormbearer's progress as he moved through the final stages of his predetermined path. The young man's connection to the Force had been altered by the opening of the 3 wounds, his spiritual resonance shifting into harmonic patterns that would allow him to channel energies that ordinary consciousness could never comprehend. Soon, very soon, he would arrive on Mustafar to complete the work that had begun with his conception in the desert wastes of Tatooine. The galaxy held its breath in the aftermath of Order 66, unaware that the true purpose of the Jedi's destruction had been not merely political, but cosmic in scope. The storm was gathering strength, the mirrors were achieving proper alignment, and the ninefold gate was beginning to take shape in the quantum foam of possibility that surrounded all moments of profound transformation. In the deepest chambers of his hidden sanctum, the Emperor smiled as he felt the Force itself beginning to bend to his will, ancient energies awakening from their long slumber to serve purposes that transcended all previous understanding of power and transcendence. The prophecy that had consumed his thoughts for so many years was no longer theoretical possibility, but approaching reality, and its fulfillment would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. The silence was the sound of preparation, the cosmic pause that precedes the birth of gods. On the molten world of Mustafar, where rivers of lava carved channels through landscapes that seemed torn from the forge of creation itself, the final movement of the cosmic symphony was about to begin. The separatist stronghold, perched on a rocky outcropping above seas of liquid fire, appeared to be nothing more than a tactical target, a final obstacle to be eliminated in the Clone Wars' inevitable conclusion. But the Emperor's hidden instruments detected far deeper significance in the fortress's placement and design. It had been positioned to serve as the perfect focusing lens for the energies that would soon be unleashed. Through sensors that could track force disturbances across interstellar distances, Palpatine observed Anakin's arrival on the volcanic world with the satisfaction of a conductor whose orchestra was finally ready to perform the masterpiece he had spent decades composing. The young man's spiritual resonance had achieved exactly the frequency patterns that the obsidian prophecies required. His consciousness now capable of channeling cosmic forces that could tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The Stormbearer moved through the Separatist stronghold like an avatar of destiny, his lightsaber carving pathways of destruction that followed patterns more complex than mere tactical necessity. Each strike released force energies that had been building within his consciousness since childhood, creating harmonic resonances that propagated through Mustafar's unique geological structures and contributed to the vast pattern of cosmic disturbance that the ritual required. Newt Gunray's death sent ripples through trade networks that spanned thousands of worlds, the severing of commercial connections, creating economic chaos that reflected the spiritual disruption occurring on deeper levels. Poggle, the Lesser's passing disrupted manufacturing processes that had supplied the galaxy's military needs for years, while Wat Tambor's elimination silenced technological innovations that had been reshaping entire sectors of galactic civilization. But the true significance of the killings lay not in their political or economic impact, but in their spiritual resonance. Each separatist leader represented a different aspect of the galactic order that would need to be symbolically destroyed before the new age could begin. Their deaths served as notes in the cosmic symphony that the ritual required, specific frequencies that combined to create exactly the kind of harmonic pattern that could weaken the barriers between dimensions. Through the Malachor Kyber lattice, properly attuned and focused, the Emperor could feel the moment when the Stormbearer's blade work achieved perfect synchronization with the cosmic forces that governed the boundary between existence and the void. The volcanic fires that surrounded the fortress began to pulse in rhythm with the young man's heartbeat, the planet itself responding to the unprecedented levels of force energy being channeled through its core. The second mirror had achieved optimal resonance, amplifying the vessel's emotional transformation into energies that approached cosmic significance. The fear, love, and betrayal that had been carefully cultivated over the course of many years were now serving their ultimate purpose, generating the specific spiritual frequencies that the prophecy required for the opening of the ninefold gate. But the ritual's true climax was yet to come. Through his network of carefully placed agents, the Emperor had arranged for Padma to arrive on Mustafar at precisely the moment when the Stormbearer's transformation would reach its critical phase. Her presence would serve as the final catalyst, the emotional trigger that would complete the vessel's metamorphosis from mortal Jedi into something that transcended all previous categories of existence. The pregnant senator's ship descended through Mustafar's sulfurous atmosphere like a moth drawn to flame, carrying within its hull the future mother of beings who would themselves serve crucial roles in the cosmic drama that was unfolding. But her immediate purpose was more fundamental. She would provide the love that would prove both salvation and destruction, the emotional anchor that would allow the Stormbearer to channel forces that might otherwise consume him entirely. As Padme emerged from her transport onto the landing platform where her husband waited, the Emperor felt the Force itself beginning to shift into configurations that defied conventional understanding of energy and matter. The third mirror, the Lothal-coded lens, was approaching perfect harmonic alignment with the vessel's transformed consciousness, preparing to focus the storm's energies into patterns that could penetrate the veil between dimensions. The confrontation that followed was more than marital discord. It was the collision of realities. The moment when the Stormbearer's carefully maintained dual nature finally collapsed into something entirely new. The young man who had been Anakin Skywalker was dying, his identity dissolving under the pressure of choices that violated everything he had previously believed about himself and his purposes. In his place, something unprecedented was being born, a consciousness capable of serving as a gateway to transcendence. The Emperor's instruments detected the precise instant when the transformation reached its critical phase. When the vessel's spiritual resonance achieved perfect harmonic alignment with the cosmic frequencies described in the ancient prophecies, the storm that had been gathering within his consciousness for so many years was finally ready to break free, and when it did, reality itself would be reshaped according to patterns that had been waiting eons for the right combination of circumstances to manifest. Through hidden chambers where artifacts spanning millennia waited to serve their ultimate purpose, energies began to flow that had not moved freely since the galaxy's youth. The ninefold gate was taking shape in the quantum foam of possibility that surrounded all moments of profound transformation. And beyond it lay mysteries that even the Emperor had only begun to comprehend. The volcanic fires of Mustafar pulsed with new rhythms as the Stormbearer completed his transformation, their molten flows responding to cosmic forces that had been awakened from their long slumber. Soon, very soon, the final act of the great drama would begin, and the galaxy would witness the birth of something that had never before existed in the known universe. The Force storm was awakening, and with it came possibilities that transcended all previous understanding of life, death, and the spaces between them. On the crystalline landing platform that jutted from Mustafar's volcanic slopes like an altar raised to honor primordial forces, two beings who had shaped each other's destinies across decades of shared history prepared to enact the final movements of a cosmic dance that had been choreographed by powers beyond mortal comprehension. Anakin Skywalker, his consciousness now resonating with frequencies that made the planet's molten core tremble in sympathetic response, faced his former master with the terrible serenity of one who had glimpsed truths that lay beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. Obi-Wan Kenobi approached the confrontation with the measured step of a being who understood that he was walking into legend, that the next few moments would echo through galactic history with consequences that neither of them could fully foresee. The Jedi Master's lightsaber hummed with familiar energies, but the Force around them had been transformed by the Stormbearer's metamorphosis into something that defied all his training and experience. Through the Emperor's network of hidden sensors, positioned throughout Mustafar's geological structures, every nuance of the approaching duel was being recorded and analyzed by instruments that could detect spiritual resonances across multiple dimensions of existence. This was not merely combat, but ritual, the final act in a cosmic drama whose significance transcended the personal tragedy of friendship destroyed by irreconcilable differences. The Emperor smiled in his distant sanctum as he felt the third mirror, the Lothal-coded lens, achieving perfect, harmonic alignment with the Stormbearer's transformed consciousness. The vessel's spiritual resonance had reached exactly the frequency patterns that the obsidian prophecies required. His connection to the Force, now powerful enough to channel energies that could tear holes in the fabric of space-time itself. As the two lightsabers met in showers of sparks that seemed to burn with their own internal fire, the very air around them began to shimmer with distortions that spoke of fundamental alterations in the local structure of reality. The storm within Anakin's consciousness was no longer contained by the psychological barriers that had shaped his identity since childhood. It was breaking free, seeking expression through channels that his former master could not possibly understand. Each exchange of blade work released force energies that propagated through Mustafar's unique geological structures, creating harmonic resonances that matched the requirements specified in the ancient prophecies. The planet's volcanic flows began to pulse in rhythm with the combatants' heartbeats, their molten streams responding to cosmic forces that had been awakened from eons of dormancy. The duel carried them across landscapes that seemed to exist at the boundary between the physical universe and the realm of dreams, over bridges of cooled lava that spanned chasms filled with fires that burned with colors not found in any conventional spectrum. With each passing moment, the Stormbearer's connection to ordinary reality grew more tenuous, his consciousness beginning to explore dimensions of existence that his Jedi training had never prepared him to comprehend. Through the Dathomiri smoke mirror, properly attuned and focused, the Emperor could observe probability streams that showed the various ways in which the confrontation might conclude. In most timelines, the vessel proved incapable of channeling the cosmic forces he had been prepared to wield, his transformation incomplete and his potential forever lost. But in a select few probability streams, the outcomes matched the prophecy's descriptions with breathtaking precision. The moment of perfect convergence arrived as the two warriors reached a narrow span of metal that stretched across a river of lava whose fires seemed to burn with the concentrated essence of creation itself. Here, where the boundaries between elements grew fluid and the laws of physics bent beneath the weight of spiritual forces, the Stormbearer's transformation reached its critical phase. Obi-Wan's voice carried across the superheated air with the weight of absolute moral certainty, words that would serve as the final catalyst for his former apprentice's metamorphosis. You were the chosen one. It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them, bring balance to the Force, not leave it in darkness. The accusation struck Anakin like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because it revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped every aspect of his relationship with the Jedi Order. He was indeed the chosen one, but his destiny was not to serve the limited vision of balance that the Jedi had constructed from their incomplete understanding of cosmic forces. He had been born to become something unprecedented, a gateway through which consciousness itself could transcend the boundaries between life and death. I hate you, the Stormbearer cried, and with those words, the final barrier fell away. The hate was not personal but cosmic, the rejection of limitations that had constrained consciousness since the galaxy's youth. It was the sound of chains breaking, of a force of nature finally achieving the freedom to express its true magnitude. The force storm that erupted from Anakin's consciousness at that moment made the volcanic fires of Mustafar seem like candle flames in comparison to a blazing star. Through the three mirrors that the Emperor had spent decades positioning and calibrating, the vessel's spiritual resonance was focused and amplified until it reached the critical intensity needed to begin tearing holes in the veil between dimensions. But the storm's power came at a price that the prophecy had always specified. The vessel's physical form began to break down under the strain of channeling energies that were never meant to flow through mortal flesh. The lightsaber strike that severed his limbs was not defeat, but transformation. The shedding of physical constraints that had prevented him from achieving his ultimate potential. As Anakin's broken body slid toward the river of lava, the Emperor felt the moment of perfect synchronization for which he had waited so many years. The ninefold gate was opening, reality itself beginning to bend beneath the weight of forces that had been building toward this instant since the night he had first discovered the obsidian fragments beneath Theed. Through the breach that the Stormbearer's anguish had torn in the veil, the Emperor's consciousness reached out to touch the luminous mystery that lay beyond death. For a brief moment that contained eternities, he glimpsed the true nature of transcendence, not the preservation of individual identity, but its expansion into something that encompassed all possible states of existence simultaneously. The knowledge that flowed through that momentary connection was intoxicating beyond description, offering insights into the fundamental nature of reality that made his previous understanding seem like the scribblings of a child compared to the wisdom of ages. But the gate was not yet stable, the vessel's transformation incomplete. The Stormbearer had opened the pathway, but he lacked the strength to maintain it without assistance. On the shores of Mustafar's lava flows, where the boundaries between elements grew fluid and consciousness could briefly touch the edges of infinity, the Emperor's greatest work was approaching its culmination. Soon, very soon, he would possess not merely political power over the galaxy's countless worlds, but the keys to transcendence itself. The Force Storm was breaking free from the constraints that had contained it for so many years. And when it achieved full expression, reality itself would be reshaped according to patterns that had been waiting eons for the right combination of circumstances to manifest. The vessel's broken form would serve as anchor and gateway, a living connection to possibilities that transcended all previous categories of existence. In the aftermath of cosmic thunder, as volcanic fires painted the sky in shades of prophecy fulfilled, the Emperor prepared to claim the prize for which he had sacrificed everything: mortality, not as preservation but as transformation, consciousness liberated from the prison of linear time and singular identity. The storm had risen, the veil had torn, and beyond the breach lay mysteries that even the ancient Sith had only dared to dream. In the deepest chambers of a Coruscant medical facility, where life and death balanced on the edge of technological miracles, Emperor Palpatine stood over the surgical table, where his greatest creation lay broken and rebuilt, transformed by fire and blade into something that transcended all previous categories of existence. The breathing apparatus that now sustained Anakin Skywalker's physical form was more than mere medical necessity, was the first component in a binding ritual that would anchor the Force Storm to the material universe, while allowing its energies to be channeled for purposes that defied conventional understanding. The black armor that enclosed the vessel's reconstructed body had been crafted according to specifications found in the most ancient Sith texts, each component inscribed with symbols that served as focusing channels for the cosmic forces that now flowed through what had once been merely mortal flesh. The Emperor's smile was cold as starlight as he contemplated the elegance of the design. The Stormbearer's physical limitations would paradoxically enhance his spiritual potential. creating exactly the kind of controlled instability that the prophecy required. Through instruments that could detect force disturbances across multiple dimensions, the Emperor observed the moment when consciousness returned to the transformed vessel. The being that awakened on that surgical table was no longer Anakin Skywalker in any meaningful sense. That identity had been burned away in the fires of Mustafar, leaving behind something unprecedented in galactic history. Lord Vader, the Emperor said, and the name carried weight that went beyond mere designation. It was invocation, the verbal key that would complete the binding between the Stormbearer-esque consciousness and the cosmic forces that had been prepared to serve the prophecy's ultimate purpose. Rise. The Dark Lord's first breath through the respirator that would sustain him for decades to come was like the drawing of cosmic tides, each inhalation and exhalation creating ripples in the force that propagated across star systems. The binding was incomplete but functional, creating a provisional anchor that would allow the Emperor to begin the long process of constructing the permanent gateway that the prophecy promised. But the ritual had exacted a price that even the ancient texts had only hinted at in their most cryptic passages. The vessel's transformation had created a connection to the cosmic forces described in the Obsidian prophecies, but that connection could not be fully controlled by conventional means. The Stormbearer's consciousness now existed partially outside normal spacetime. His awareness expanded into dimensions that his physical form could experience only indirectly. The Emperor felt a thrill of satisfaction mixed with frustration as he contemplated the magnificence and limitations of what he had achieved. The Force Storm had been successfully awakened and partially bound, creating a living gateway to transcendence that could serve his ultimate purposes. But the vessel's rebellious nature, the very independence that had made him suitable for the prophecy's requirements, also made him resistant to complete domination. The binding that connected Lord Vader to his master was not the simple relationship of apprentice to teacher that it appeared to be on the surface. It was a cosmic tether, a connection that allowed the Emperor to access the Stormbearer's expanded consciousness while preventing that consciousness from achieving complete freedom. Through that connection, he could taste the transcendent possibilities that lay beyond the veil, could glimpse the immortality that the prophecy promised without yet being able to claim it fully. In the years that would follow, the Emperor would work to strengthen and refine the binding, using techniques that blended advanced technology with force manipulations that predated the rise of the Republic. Hidden observatories would be constructed on worlds where the barriers between dimensions grew thin, creating a network of focusing stations that could channel the vessel's energies across interstellar distances. The Death Star project, ostensibly designed as the ultimate expression of Imperial military might, would serve a deeper purpose as a mobile focusing lens, capable of concentrating the Stormbearer's spiritual resonance into energies that could be used for purposes far more profound than the mere destruction of planets. Through that artificial moon's core systems, properly modified and enhanced, the Emperor would be able to project his consciousness across the galaxy, using Lord Vader's expanded awareness as a bridge to dimensions that ordinary mortals could never access. But all of that lay in a future that would require decades of patient work to achieve. For now, the Emperor was content to savor the preliminary success of his great work, knowing that he had accomplished something that no being in galactic history had ever achieved before. The Four-Storm prophecy was no longer theoretical possibility, but manifest reality. Its chosen vessel bound to serve purposes that transcended his understanding, even as they elevated him beyond the limitations of mortal existence. Through the surgical facility's windows, the lights of Coruscant's endless city sparkled like scattered stars, each point of radiance representing millions of lives that would soon be touched by the consequences of what had transpired in that medical chamber. The galaxy had entered a new age, though its inhabitants would not recognize the magnitude of the transformation for many years to come. In the depths of space, where cosmic forces moved in patterns too vast for ordinary consciousness to comprehend, something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between existence and the void that surrounded it. The veil between dimensions had been weakened, creating possibilities that had not existed since the galaxy's youth. Through that weakness, consciousness could begin to explore realms that had been sealed away since the ancient days, when the boundaries between realities were more fluid and transcendence was a living possibility rather than a forgotten dream. The Emperor's laughter echoed through the medical facility as he contemplated the magnificence of what lay ahead. The vessel was bound, the storm was anchored, and the pathway to immortality had been opened. In time, that pathway would be widened and stabilized, creating a permanent bridge to forms of existence that transcended all previous understanding of life and death. Lord Vader's first steps in his new form carried the weight of cosmic significance, each movement creating ripples in the Force that would propagate through the centuries ahead. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but its fulfillment was only the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. The Force storm had risen, and with it had come possibilities that would echo throughout eternity. And so, dear travelers of the infinite dark, we close this tale of storms and shadows, of prophecies fulfilled through fires that burned hotter than the hearts of dying stars. You have witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, a being who served as both anchor and gateway, a living bridge between the realm of mortality and the luminous mysteries that lie beyond death's threshold. The Emperor's great work was complete in its first movement. The Force storm awakened and bound to serve purposes that transcended all previous understanding of power and transcendence. Through decades of patient manipulation, he had transformed a child of the desert into an instrument of cosmic significance, a vessel whose very breath could stir currents in dimensions that ordinary consciousness could never access. But this ending was also a beginning, for the prophecy's fulfillment had opened doorways that would never again be completely sealed. In the vast spaces between stars, consciousness had learned new ways to travel, and the boundaries that had once seemed absolute had proven to be gossamer curtains that could be drawn aside by those who possessed the knowledge and will to attempt such transformations. Let this ancient wisdom settle into your dreams like starlight falling on still water. Let the cosmic rhythms that governed the rise and fall of empires carry you into the peaceful darkness where all stories find their rest. The galaxy's greatest secrets have been whispered in your ears, and now the endless night waits to embrace you with the gentle touch of infinite possibility. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the music of distant storms.